25 October 1944, Philippine Sea, just east of Samar. Dawn breaks slowly across a restless ocean. Low gray clouds cling to the horizon as rain squalls drift over choppy waves. On the decks of a small American task unit, known simply as Taffy 3, sailors wipe sleep from their eyes and prepare for another day of air support in the Battle for Leyte. Their ships are modest, thin-hulled escort carriers, lightly armed and lightly armored, protected only by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Then the calm fractures. Massive water plumes erupt around them. The distant thunder of naval guns rolls over the sea. Lookouts freeze, stunned by what they see emerging from the mist. Towering silhouettes, warships the size of city blocks. A Japanese battleship formation, closer than anyone believed possible. Among the Americans, one destroyer begins to accelerate.
By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had entered a relentless phase. Island after island had fallen to American forces, each victory tightening the strategic grip around the Empire of Japan. The U.S. Navy now controlled vast stretches of ocean. Long-range bombers threatened the Japanese homeland. Supply routes were collapsing. A once mighty fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants, fighting to delay the inevitable. But there was still a critical barrier standing between the Allies and eventual victory: the Philippines. It was the crossroads of Japan's empire, a vital chain connecting the resource fields of Southeast Asia with the factories of the home islands. If the Philippines were cut off, the Japanese war machine would suffocate. General Douglas MacArthur carried another burden besides strategy. 2 years earlier, he had been forced to abandon the islands under orders, leaving tens of thousands of Americans and Filipinos behind. His promise to return became a lightning rod for national resolve. Now, with every ship and aircraft at his disposal, he intended to fulfill it. The battle to retake the Philippines began on 20 October 1944, as American amphibious forces stormed ashore on the island of Leyte. The invasion fleet was enormous, a display of overwhelming Allied strength, but its logistical heart remained exposed. Hundreds of transports and troop ships lay vulnerable offshore. Their protection depended on layered defenses, including groups of small escort carriers stationed nearby to provide aircraft for ground support. These were not frontline naval strike forces. Their pilots hunted submarines and bombed enemy positions inland. Their ships were slower and lightly armored than fleet carriers, intended to survive by distance rather than raw strength. The escort carriers of Taffy 3, led by Rear Admiral Clifton Spragg, operated under this assumption of relative safety. Japan's high command saw the danger with clarity. If the Philippines were lost, the empire's defeat would accelerate beyond recovery. They devised Operation Shogo, a desperate but ambitious plan to force a massive showdown. Their remaining naval power would strike in a three-pronged assault. One force would lure powerful American carrier fleets away to the north, another would attack from the south, and the strongest of the three, the center force, would slip into the Philippine Sea to tear into the unshielded invasion fleet. The Americans believed that the center force had already been neutralized. Submarines and air attacks had inflicted heavy losses, and radar screens gave no warning of its return. Sailors on the morning watch aboard Taffy 3 prepared for another day of routine operations. Nothing suggested that within minutes they would be staring at the largest group of enemy warships they would ever encounter. The calm was deceptive. Over the curve of the horizon, the sound of distant thunder was growing. The danger that American intelligence had dismissed was now racing toward unsuspecting ships and toward the destroyer that would soon choose to confront it alone.
Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet had already suffered deep wounds. American submarines and waves of carrier-launched aircraft had sunk the battleship Musashi and battered numerous cruisers. Kurita himself had briefly turned back, shaken and uncertain, which convinced many in the U.S. Navy that the threat from Japan's center force had been eliminated. But under the cover of darkness and worsening weather, Kurita reversed course once again. Steering through the narrow San Bernardino Strait, his surviving warships, including the colossal Yamato, capable of firing 18-inch shells across dozens of miles, were not retreating. They were pushing forward, determined to strike a decisive blow. Just after dawn, the sea east of Samar revealed a scene none of the Americans expected. On the horizon advanced the largest concentration of enemy firepower remaining in the Pacific. Battleships as large as office towers, heavy cruisers lined with gun turrets, and destroyers knifing through the waves in escort formation. All of them headed directly toward the light escort carriers of Taffy 3. These U.S. carriers were built to support landings with slow Wildcats and torpedo-carrying Avengers, aircraft suited for hunting submarines and striking beaches, not armored giants in open-sea combat. Their defensive screen was thin. Only 3 destroyers and 4 smaller destroyer escorts sailed nearby. It was a protective shell that could be shattered with a single broadside. On the destroyer USS Johnston, crew members were waking to what they thought would be another routine day of air support. Men tightened their life vests. Some joked as they drank their first coffee. Radar technicians saw nothing unusual. In the wheelhouse stood Commander Ernest E. Evans. He had a reputation for boldness bordering on recklessness, a man who believed American warships existed not to run, but to fight. When Johnston was commissioned, he told his crew that he intended to take their ship into harm's way. Those weren't empty words. At 0637, lookouts aboard Taffy 3 spotted the impossible. Shell splashes rose around the formation like towering geysers. The crackling sound of long-range naval guns echoed across the ocean. Officers shouted for binoculars. What they saw chilled them. Massive pagoda masts and triple-gun turrets, unmistakably Japanese capital ships. Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered the escort carriers to make smoke and fall back at full speed. Pilots scrambled to launch every aircraft, even those without proper armament. But Evans saw a harsher truth. Smoke would not stop what was coming. Those monstrous ships were advancing fast and directly toward the transports supporting MacArthur's landings at Leyte. If the Japanese were not slowed, the slaughter on shore could be catastrophic. So he made a decision no one expected. He ordered full throttle. Johnston heeled over, bow slicing into the waves. One lone destroyer began to charge an entire fleet, and every man aboard understood what that meant.
The sudden appearance of Kurita's fleet placed Taffy 3 in a tactical nightmare. Every variable favored the Japanese. Their warships were faster, better armored, and armed with guns that could outrange anything the Americans had. The engagement was unfolding at a distance where the U.S. escort carriers could barely respond. The Japanese side could shoot from miles beyond visual detail and still land devastating blows. From a purely strategic standpoint, the Americans should have run. And they did. The escort carriers turned away at maximum speed, laying down smoke to obscure their thin flight decks from the enemy's view. Their only hope was to escape into rain squalls and pray reinforcements would arrive before annihilation. Yet running alone would only delay destruction. Without intervention, Kurita's fleet would easily steam past the screen and fall upon the vulnerable transports supporting the invasion of Leyte. This is where the destroyers came into play. Fast, aggressive, and carrying torpedoes powerful enough to cripple a battleship, these smaller ships were the last offensive tools available. Their job was never to defeat battleships head-on, merely to deter them long enough for carriers to reposition or flee. But the scale of what approached them was beyond any training scenario or tactical doctrine. Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on Johnston's open bridge, exposed to wind and spray as his crew looked towards him for guidance. He had no doubts about what needed to be done. The larger fleet might not fully understand the threat yet, but he did. A force this enormous could not be masked by smoke or slowed by evasive maneuvers. The only way to protect the carriers was to attack. His decision was stark and immediate. He ordered Johnston to accelerate to flank speed and steer directly toward the incoming shells. Men scrambled to battle station. The engine crew pushed the turbines to their limits, shaking the hull. Gun crews removed safety pins and strained to track targets with optical sights, knowing they were already being measured by superior fire control radars. It was not only Americans reacting to an impossible situation. Japanese gunners, scanning through rangefinders, watched in disbelief as a single destroyer emerged from the smoke. They expected retreat. Instead, the Americans were advancing, and with reckless precision. A ship as small as Johnston had to close distance quickly. Only at short range did its torpedoes become a true threat. Every nautical mile gained increased both the danger to the Japanese and the risk to Johnston's crew. The tactical gamble was enormous. A battleship shell striking Johnston could rip open half her deck. A cruiser salvo could break her keel in an instant. Johnston knew this. His men knew this. Yet the destroyer surged forward. Aircraft from the escort carriers joined the fight as soon as they could launch, even those armed only with machine guns or carrying depth charges useless against warships. Pilots swooped down to distract cruisers and destroyers, trying to slow their advance with sheer audacity. All eyes in Kurita's fleet now focused on the spectacle of American ships behaving as if they were the stronger force. Johnston closed distance through towering waterspouts kicked up by massive gunfire. One shell passed so close that sailors instinctively ducked, despite knowing that distance meant survival or death, not posture. The sound was like freight trains tearing the sky apart. The battle was shifting into a close-range duel, the kind few expected and none wanted. Johnston's bow continued to lift and fall through the waves, unflinching, committed to its charge. Every meter gained meant the torpedoes were closer to lethal range. Every second burned meant the carriers had more to live. The moment of contact was rapidly approaching, and there would be no turning back.
As Johnston surged forward, the mood aboard changed from confusion to grim clarity. The men understood exactly what their captain intended. Their destroyer wasn't built to go toe-to-toe with battleships or cruisers. Yet that was the path ahead. Sailors who just minutes earlier had been easing into a routine morning now faced the most lopsided naval duel imaginable. Inside the gun mounts, crews steadied themselves, fighting sea spray and rising smoke. Those near the torpedo tubes checked firing systems with shaking hands, not from fear, but urgency. Every second mattered. The closer they got, the greater their single chance of making a hit. Each man's focus narrowed into a strange calm. Do the job, trust the captain. Evans' intensity radiated across the ship. He stood exposed on the bridge, issuing commands with unwavering confidence. At that moment, rank differences disappeared. Everyone on Johnston was bound by the same truth. Survival depended on action, not caution. Evans embodied that belief. His aggression was so absolute that it seemed to push the ship faster. Meanwhile, the Japanese sailors, staring back through their optics, struggled to make sense of the reckless charge. To them, American destroyers were expected to defend carriers defensively, not spearhead attacks against overwhelming force. The sight of Johnston closing rapidly through splashes of near-miss shells appeared almost unreal. Some Japanese officers reportedly believed they were dealing with a far larger group hidden behind smoke. No rational enemy, they thought, would behave like this unless supported by unseen power. That misconception, that psychological distortion, bought precious moments. From the escort carriers behind, pilots began to circle overhead, attacking as soon as ammunition allowed. Some aircraft carried nothing but machine gun rounds or depth charges. Still, they made repeated passes, harassing Japanese gunners, forcing larger ships to maneuver. One Avenger pilot later recalled thinking, "If I can just get their heads down for a few seconds, maybe someone else survives." Across the sea, fear, confusion, and disbelief tangled together. On both sides, the Americans faced the shock of witnessing giant warships raining destruction. The Japanese, despite their firepower, felt hunted by something reckless and unpredictable. Johnston's single-minded charge warped the mental battlefield, bending logic and strategy into a fight fueled by will. The cost came quickly. A heavy cruiser found its mark. A shell tore into Johnston's forward superstructure, shredding metal and wounding sailors. But instead of slowing, the destroyer leaned harder into the waves. Damage control crews rushed to seal compartments. Gunners resumed firing. The ship behaved like a wounded predator still advancing toward its prey. For every American sailor staring death in the face, there was also a profound sense of purpose. They understood the stakes. If the Japanese broke through, thousands of troops landing on Leyte, men with no naval defense, would be at the mercy of giant guns. Their destroyer had become the only blade raised between a fleet of giants and a disaster ashore. Each mile closed, each shell dodged, each burst of smoke laid behind them, tightened the psychological grip they forced upon their enemy. Johnston was almost within torpedo range. The crew braced for the moment that would define everything. The charge was no longer just a decision, it was destiny, rushing toward impact.
Johnston raced into the jaws of the Japanese fleet, with engines straining and hull quaking. At 0710 a.m., the range finally closed to within striking distance. Precision meant everything now. Torpedoes were Johnston's only real weapon against armored cruisers, the only tool capable of shattering their advance. Commander Evans ordered the helm to swing sharply, bringing the port-side torpedo tubes to bear. Through binoculars, officers identified one of the forward Japanese cruisers, Kumano, a ship more than twice Johnston's length, bristling with guns powerful enough to dismantle destroyers with a single hit. Evans gave the command. The torpedoes fired. 10 deadly shapes streaking beneath the surface toward a target that had no idea how close the Americans had come. The crew held their breath as seconds stretched thin. Then, a towering explosion burst beneath Kumano's bow. Metal buckled. Flames rolled upward. The cruiser's forward section tore open, and her formation fell apart as she slowed to avoid sinking. For the first time that morning, the Japanese advance hesitated. Johnston was already altering course, laying down smoke and pushing closer to other enemy ships. Every movement risked total destruction, but Evans was relentless. He ordered his 5-inch guns to focus on the nearest heavy cruiser, Haguro. Shell after shell slammed into the larger vessel's superstructure, smashing rangefinders and silencing gun mounts. Each hit was a reminder that ferocity could challenge even overwhelming might. The punishment came swiftly in return. A storm of armor-piercing shells crashed around Johnston. One direct hit disabled the forward turret, killing or injuring many inside. Another smashed through the bridge area, tearing through communications lines and wounding Evans with shrapnel. Blood ran down his uniform, but he refused to step back from the rail. He simply wrapped a cloth around his hand and kept giving orders. Below decks, the situation grew more desperate. Fires spread through compartments. Water flooded in from torn-open seams at the bow. Engineers fought blind in the smoke-filled heat, working by touch to keep turbines turning. Still, Johnston maintained speed. Still, she fired. The Japanese were stunned by the destroyer's aggression. To them, this was the behavior of a larger force. Kurita had expected the Americans to scatter. Instead, a single ship had crippled a cruiser and was continuing the attack with the ferocity of a battleship hunter. Carrier-based aircraft continued to strike wherever they could. Bombs dropped without fuses armed. Pilots used machine guns to rake enemy bridges, anything to slow the advance. Johnston turned again, this time focusing on another cruiser. Her aft guns barked out shells in rapid rhythm. Gunners strained to reload faster than the cycle allowed. They shouted target adjustments through smoke as gun shields rattled and steel fragments sprayed across the deck. At one point, the Japanese fired armor-piercing shells that passed clean through Johnston's thin hull before detonating in the water beyond, their immense power literally too great for such a small target. It was a momentary stroke of fortune. The destroyer was too light to trigger their fuses. But luck had limits. More hits landed. The ship shook violently with each impact. Her speed dropped. She listed to one side. Communications failed completely when a shell destroyed the radio room. The internal telephone network flickered and went dead. Orders were now relayed by runners, men sprinting through flames and splintered passageways to carry Evans' words. Yet the charge continued, minute by minute, mile by mile. For the first crucial half-hour of the battle, Johnston's attack became the spear point of an improvised American counterstrike. Her crew bought time with every torpedo, every round fired, every dangerous maneuver. and that time allowed other U.S. destroyers, Hull and Heermann, to join the fight. The destroyers were now a pack. The defenders were no longer running, they were biting. The next phase of the battle would push Johnston beyond braking limits, but the ship refused to fall back. It was still in motion, still firing, still standing between giants and the defenseless.
As Johnston fought like a ship many times her size, the battle widened into a swirling brawl. Hull and Heermann, inspired by the audacity of the lone destroyer in the lead, began their own torpedo runs. Smoke clouds blended into rain squalls, turning the seascape into a shifting maze where visibility rose and vanished in seconds. Each American destroyer seemed to appear suddenly out of the gray, unleash a furious attack, then disappear behind another wall of smoke. Johnston pressed deeper in the danger than any of them, but the cost was mounting. The forward engine was knocked out by another direct hit, sharply reducing speed. More fires raged. The deck grew slick with oil and seawater. Gun crews worked through choking fumes, coughing into their sleeves, refusing to abandon their posts. Wounded men dragged themselves to new stations, replacing fallen shipmates without being asked. Through the chaos, Commander Evans remained upright on the bridge, coat shredded by blast fragments, eyelids stinging from smoke. His voice had grown hoarse from shouting orders through the roar of gunfire and exploding steel. But any sailor who met his eyes saw only one message there: keep fighting. Around 08:20 a.m., Johnston found herself dangerously isolated, ahead of the other American ships and directly targeted by enemy cruisers. Salvos from Chikuma and other heavy units began finding their mark with brutal consistency. One shell struck the starboard side near the waterline, causing massive flooding. Another slammed into the aft gunhouse, killing nearly the entire crew inside. Yet the surviving guns kept firing. A damaged mount was manually cranked by sailors using their own bodies as leverage. The Japanese, shocked earlier by the destroyer's boldness, now focused on eliminating it completely. Evans refused to retreat. Even at reduced speed, he ordered Johnston toward Chikuma, closing for one more gun duel. The 5-inch batteries hammered the cruiser's superstructure, damaging instruments and silencing more turrets. One Japanese officer later recalled astonishment that a ship so small could still inflict punishment after suffering so much. Then Johnston's fate worsened. A cluster of hits destroyed the remaining engines. The destroyer shuddered to a halt, rocking helplessly in the waves. Smoke poured from vents. Ammunition lockers overheated. The bow began sinking slightly. She was now a stationary target in the center of enemy fire. But even immobilized, she kept firing. Gun crews passed shells hand to hand from damaged hoists. Machine gunners swept Japanese decks when ships drew close enough to see faces behind gun shields. Torpedo men, with all tubes empty, armed rifles and shot into the smoke, anything to slow the inevitable. At the same time, aircraft from Taffy 3 made one desperate run after another. Some pilots radioed they were down to nothing. No bombs, no torpedoes, not even machine gun rounds. They dropped empty bomb racks to distract gunners. They flew directly over gun barrels to force enemy ships to adjust aim. They risked their lives simply to keep the attention away from the weakest ships behind. By 9 a.m., Johnston had taken so much damage that her electronic systems were gone, steering was lost, and only one 5-inch gun remained in action. And still she fought. Even as the ship slowed to a crawl, the crew watched something extraordinary unfold. The massive Japanese fleet, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, was no longer advancing confidently. Their formation had splintered. Their guns were firing in multiple directions. They were maneuvering defensively. They were confused. The lone destroyer, bloodied, burning, barely afloat, had forced the enemy to reconsider its attack. Then, in an outcome almost no American sailor would have dared to imagine, ships the size of skyscrapers began to turn away. One after another, Japanese captains, believing they faced a far greater threat, chose to withdraw. Kurita, seeing his formations in disorder and uncertain of what hidden danger lay beyond the smoke, ordered a general retreat. A ship that should have been ignored or crushed instantly instead caused a fleet to abandon its mission. The guns of Johnston, by sheer will, had changed the course of the battle. But for the men aboard her, the fight was not over. Their ship was dying under them, and now they would face the hardest part, surviving what came next.
When Johnston finally fell silent, the sea did not. Explosions continued across the horizon as other American ships, Hoel, Heermann, and the escort carriers fought on with equal desperation. Yet something critical had changed. The Japanese attack, once a crushing wall of steel, had splintered into hesitation. Kurita, peering through haze and smoke, no longer trusted what his eyes showed. He had expected a decisive strike against vulnerable carriers. Instead, he had encountered destroyers attacking like wolves, aircraft swarming like hornets, and resistance so fierce that he believed he faced far greater force than reality. Conflicting reports reached his flagship. Radio operators misread signals. Officers warned of potential ambushes by large American fleets. And all the while, time bled away. The carriers of Taffy III widened their distance with every minute stolen by Johnston's sacrifice. The transports supporting the Leyte landings remained untouched, their survival clinging to the thin thread of a few destroyers' courage. In the water, sailors from Johnston clung to floating wreckage. Oil coated their skin, and salt stung their wounds. Some were blinded, many were burned. Sharks circled. Hours passed beneath a punishing sun, punctuated by distant thunder of continuing gunfire. Among them was Ernest Evans. He had refused help from the moment he entered the ocean. Witnesses recalled him urging others to stay calm, to hold on a little longer, to survive. His voice carried strength even as his injuries worsened. Eventually, he slipped beneath the waves, not seen again. Back at the surface fight, the determination of American defenders continued to influence every decision Kurita made. He could see the burning remains of his damaged cruisers. He had watched a destroyer nearly disable another. He had expected dominance. Instead, he had been slowed, confused, and bloodied by ships that should have been prey. Shortly after 9:20 a.m., he gave the order that stunned both sides. The Japanese fleet would withdraw. The battleships turned away. The cruisers disengaged. Destroyers that had rushed eagerly into the fight now reversed course, laying smoke of their own. The sea that had been filled with advancing giants was suddenly clearing of enemy shapes. To the sailors still fighting aboard American ships, the view was surreal. They had braced themselves for annihilation, and instead they watched the enemy retreat. There was no cheer, only exhaustion, relief mixed with disbelief, and a deep growing awareness that an almost impossible victory had been earned by men who refused to yield. But the cost was only beginning to be understood. Survivors in the water had a long wait ahead. Those on the remaining ships faced the task of counting who was missing, and the world had not yet heard of the destroyer that challenged fate itself. The consequences of that morning would shape the way nations understood bravery. Hours after the battle had quieted, the Philippine Sea remained haunted by the cries of men clinging to life. Survivors from Johnston drifted in groups, trying to stay together as the sun beat down. Some were delirious from thirst, others could barely keep their heads above the oil-coated water. They had seen their ship fight to the end, and now they fought to survive long enough to be rescued. Not all would live to see that moment. Sharks circled repeatedly, drawn by blood and chaos. Some sailors were dragged under, while others watched helplessly, unable to move fast enough to intervene. Exposure claimed more victims as the day turned to night and back into day again. It took nearly 50 hours before search vessels reached the area. By then, many who had survived the battle had perished in the water. When reports finally reached higher command, a full understanding of what Taffy III had accomplished began to take shape. A few destroyers and escort carriers had turned away one of the most powerful naval strike forces ever assembled. A Japanese armada had been forced to abandon its mission, not because the Americans possessed greater guns or armor, but because they demonstrated a level of aggression and resolve that defied logic. Word of Johnston's charge spread quickly through the fleet. Sailors repeated the story as a legend already forming. A destroyer had taken on battleships and cruisers head-on, inflicting real damage and slowing the enemy long enough for others to escape. That legend grew stronger as survivors recounted how Commander Ernest Evans had led from the front, refusing shelter or rest, even as he bled across the deck. In the months following the battle, formal recognition began. Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor, posthumously, for actions described as beyond valor. He became the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive the nation's highest military decoration. Many of his crew received the Navy Cross and Silver Star, honors that acknowledge their courage under impossible conditions. For the Japanese side, the aftermath carried a different weight. Admiral Kurita later spoke with admiration about the American destroyer's bravery. He admitted that their unexpected ferocity had convinced him he faced a much larger, better defended force. The psychological effect of Johnston's attack, of seeing a lone ship charge into overwhelming fire, had reshaped his understanding of the battle in real time. In strategic terms, the result was monumental. Kurita's withdrawal ensured the safety of the landing force on Leyte. Without the sacrifice of Taffy 3, the Japanese might have inflicted catastrophic losses on the invasion fleet, potentially altering the course of the campaign. Instead, the landings held. MacArthur's return to the Philippines remained secure. The Pacific War marched one step closer to Japan's doorstep. The price had been devastating, but history would remember what the men of Johnston gave that morning and what their defiance prevented. The story did not end with the sinking of a ship. It continued in the memory of every sailor who witnessed the charge and in the legacy that followed.
On the morning of October 25, 1944, the USS Johnston should have been a footnote, a small ship facing superior force with no realistic chance of survival. Instead, her name became a symbol of what courage looks like when stripped of all expectations. A destroyer cannot defeat battleships in a duel of strength, but Johnston and her crew proved that strength alone does not determine the outcome of battle. Determination, the will to act when the mind insists retreat, can reshape the fate of thousands. For 2 hours, the ocean bore witness to an extraordinary truth. Bravery can distort the logic of war. A single destroyer, led by a commander who refused to do anything but attack, created enough fear and confusion to halt an entire fleet. That act of defiance protected the fragile lifeline of an invasion and saved countless lives on the shores of Leyte. The sailors who fought and died aboard Johnston were not driven by the hope of recognition. They fought because they saw what would happen if they did not. Their sacrifice became a shield laid across the future of the Pacific campaign. Today, the name Johnston is spoken with reverence by those who study naval history. Her story reminds us that heroism is not measured by survival or size, but by the choices made when every path leads into danger. When the sea finally claimed the ship, it could not claim the legacy. That belongs to the men who chose to charge toward fire and changed the course of history. Their courage stunned everyone watching. It still does.